I wasn't looking for roads when I started this investigation. I was deep in a completely different rabbit hole, tracing the architectural anomalies of mid-19th century railway stations across Central Asia, specifically the inexplicable uniformity of their vaulted ceilings and the strange acoustic properties that engineers today struggle to replicate with modern materials. That was my focus. Stations, ceilings, sound. But somewhere in the archives of a small digitized collection maintained by a regional historical society in Kazan, I found something that stopped me completely. It wasn't a building. It was a road. More precisely, it was a surveyor's notation from 1847 describing a road that, according to notation itself, had already been there for no less than 2 centuries prior. The handwriting was careful, bureaucratic, the kind of precision you associate with Imperial Russian administrative documents. And the surveyor wasn't celebrating the road. He was confused by it. He noted the surface material as unlike anything currently produced in the region, described the subsurface drainage as engineered with sophistication exceeding present capability. And then, and this is the part that made me sit back on my screen, he asked the superiors in St. Petersburg for guidance on how to classify it, because no record of its construction existed anywhere in the imperial archives. The response he received was brief. He was told to note it as a legacy Roman-style trade path and move on. No further investigation was authorized. No geological survey was commissioned. No engineering analysis was conducted. A road of unknown origin, of impossible sophistication for its supposed era, was given a label and buried in administrative paperwork. That was the moment. Sitting in my chair reading a digitized scan of a 175-year-old bureaucratic exchange, when the official explanations began to collapse. The first thing I did after finding that surveyor's notation was try to find the road itself. This is harder than it sounds. Modern satellite mapping has transformed historical geography research, but it has also, paradoxically, made certain things harder to find. When infrastructure is paved over, built upon, or rerouted, the original layer vanishes from contemporary images. What I needed were older maps, and I found them. The David Rumsey Map Collection, one of the most comprehensive digitized historical cartography archives in the world, holds thousands of maps spanning the 16th through 20th centuries. Among these, I began cross-referencing road notations across maps of the Eurasian steppe region, specifically the area historically designated on European maps as Tartaria or Grand Tartary. What I found was not a single road, but a network, a system of routes connecting points across an enormous geographical expanse with consistency that defied what we're told about infrastructure development in this region. On a 1737 map, produced by the French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Ienville, I traced a major road corridor running northeast from the Caspian Sea toward the Ob River basin. The road is marked with a specificity that cartographers typically reserve for well-established, well-traveled routes. It isn't speculative. It isn't a dotted line indicating a possible path. It is a solid, confident marking indicating known, existing infrastructure. The same corridor appears on a 1755 German atlas, a 1762 British Admiralty reference map, and a 1784 Russian imperial survey, each produced independently, each marking the same road with the same confidence. Now here is where it becomes interesting. Engineering analysis of surviving road fragments in the Ural foothills region, fragments documented by Soviet-era geological survey teams in the 1960s, whose reports I accessed through a declassified Russian state archive database, reveal surface construction inconsistent with what we expect from pre-industrial road building. The reports describe a compacted aggregate surface using materials not quarried locally, with subsurface layer what the Soviet engineers called vitrified substrate, essentially a fused, glass-like underlayer that suggests exposure to intense, uniform heat during construction. The thickness of this layer averaged 14 centimeters across multiple sample sites, spread over 200 kilometers of corridor, 14 centimeters of vitrified substrate, uniform depth, across 200 kilometers. The grain of the material matched across samples taken at sites 80 kilometers apart. That is not random geological formation. That is engineering. The Soviet engineers who wrote these reports were not romantics. They were pragmatic materialist scientists working within a strictly empirical framework. And even they cannot explain the vitrified substrate using known pre-industrial techniques. Their official classification, anomalous geological feature, requiring further study. Further study was never conducted. The reports were filed. The roads were paved over during Soviet infrastructure expansion in the 1970s. The photographs from the survey teams, grainy, high-contrast black and white images of exposed road cross-sections, still exist. The shadows fall correctly across the strata layers. The scale bars match. These photographs predated any technology that could plausibly fake them, and they show something that has no official explanation. The official academic position, when I've been able to get anyone to engage with the question at all, is that these are either natural geological formations misidentified by non-specialist Soviet surveyors, or remnants of known trade routes whose construction methods have been romanticized in secondary sources. I find neither explanation satisfying. The Soviet Geological Survey teams included trained materials engineers. The cross-section photographs show clearly artificial stratification, and the cartographic record from 4 independent European sources predates the Soviet surveys by 2 centuries. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. What truly disturbed me as I continued this investigation was not any single piece of evidence in isolation. It was the repetition. The same pattern, appearing in locations separated by thousands of miles, with an unsettling precision that coincidence cannot absorb. In the 1880s, American railroad surveyors working the expansion routes of the transcontinental network reported, in company logs now held at the Newberry Library in Chicago, encountering pre-existing graded corridors in the high desert of Nevada and Utah, linear depressions in the landscape that ran for miles with consistent gradient of approximately 0.8%, ideal for wheeled vehicle transit, in terrain where no wheeled vehicle transit had any business, existing according to accepted historical accounts of the region. The surveyors noted that laying track along these corridors was significantly easier than expected precisely because the ground had, in their words, already been prepared. In Argentina, specifically in the Pampas region southwest of Buenos Aires, 19th century Spanish land survey documents held at the Archivo General de la Nación described wide, compacted corridors crossing the grassland that local indigenous communities could not account for and that no Spanish or Portuguese colonial administration had built. The surveyors measured these corridors at between 12 and 18 meters in width, far wider than simple footpaths, far more engineered than animal tracks. In India, British colonial survey teams working the Deccan Plateau region in the 1860s noted, in reports now archived at the British Library in London, the existence of road beds in remote areas that the local population referred to as paths of the old people, whose origins no living tradition could explain. The material composition of these road beds was described as foreign to local geology, meaning the aggregate had been brought from elsewhere, and in St. Petersburg itself, or rather, in the deep countryside of what was then the Novgorod gubernia, northwest Russia, an 1891 Imperial Land Commission report describes a buried road surface uncovered during agricultural drainage work, lying approximately 1.2 meters below the current ground level, constructed of fitted stone blocks averaging 60 by 40 centimeters, with interlocking edges that required no mortar. The road was 9 meters wide. It ran, as best the commission could determine, in the direction of the Finnish coast. No Roman presence in this region has ever been established. No medieval Russian principality is documented to have built roads of this specification. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across Nevada, Buenos Aires, Delhi, St. Petersburg. The same widths, the same engineering logic, the same absence of any official builder. Who built them, and who were they built for? The answer to that question, or rather, the direction in which the evidence points when you follow it honestly, leads somewhere that mainstream historiography has worked very hard to make seem ridiculous. It leads to Tartaria. Not the Tartaria of fantasy, not a science fiction civilization, not a myth. The Tartaria that appears on maps. Because here is something that requires no conspiracy to verify. You can verify it yourself in any major digital map archive. From the early 1600s to the late 1700s, European cartographers, French, British, Dutch, German, Italian, consistently marked a vast territory across northern and central Asia with the label Tartaria or Grand Tartary. This territory, on some maps, stretched from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coast. On the most detailed maps, it was subdivided: Muscovite Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. It had internal geography. It had named cities. It had, on the most detailed specimens, road networks. Not a legend, not a myth, a named, mapped, politically recognized territory that appeared in the cartographic consensus of educated Europe for nearly 2 centuries. And then it stopped appearing, not gradually, not through a process of territorial redefinition that left administrative records. The territory simply ceased to be named on maps, beginning roughly in the late 18th century and completing its disappearance from the cartographic record by approximately 1820. No major war conquest ended Tartaria. No treaty renamed it. No succession of states claimed its territory with documented continuity. It was not conquered. It was not renamed. It was erased. When you lay the road network data I've described, the Soviet survey fragments, the American railroad reports, the Argentine land surveys, the British colonial observations, the Russian Imperial Land Commission findings over the historical cartographic footprint of Grand Tartary, the geographic overlap becomes impossible to ignore. The roads are where Tartaria was. The anomalous infrastructure, the engineered corridors, the vitrified substrates, the unknown aggregate materials, they cluster within the former cartographic territory of civilization that the modern historical consensus pretends did not meaningfully exist. That cannot be coincidence. The connection between the roads and Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore. The newspapers knew. That is perhaps the most striking aspect of this entire investigation, and the one that took me the longest to piece together. Because the evidence is fragmentary by design. Consider the following. The Siberian Gazette, Tomsk, 1893. A report describing the excavation of a paved highway of unknown construction during the laying of Trans-Siberian Railway foundations near Krasnoyarsk, with the observation that the road surface appeared to have been manufactured rather than assembled. The engineer quoted in the article expressed bewilderment that no local historical record accounted for it. The story ran once. It was not followed up. The Rocky Mountain Tribune, Denver, 1871. A surveyor's account of preformed road cuts in the high country west of the Continental Divide, described as corridors of such regularity as to suggest deliberate engineering by a civilization of considerable means. The article speculated briefly about pre-Columbian road builders before the editor's note at the end redirected readers to more probable geological explanations. One article. No follow-up. The Calcutta Engineering Review, 1884. A technical paper submitted by a British colonial surveyor describing road bed samples from the Deccan with a mineral-binding agent unknown to current engineering practice that rendered the surface resistant to erosion in a manner not duplicated by present methods. The paper was submitted to 2 professional bodies. Neither published it in full. An abstract appeared in one journal. The full technical data was never made publicly available. The St. Petersburg Imperial Geographic Bulletin, 1897. A brief notice, barely 4 paragraphs, describing the discovery of a subterranean road surface in the Volga region, 1.8 meters below contemporary ground level, of a construction quality surpassing current provincial road building standards. The notice asked whether any reader had knowledge of historical construction in the region. No responses were published. The New South Wales Colonial Survey Report, Sydney, 1878, a government document, not a newspaper but a public administrative record, noting linear terrain modifications of artificial character in the interior plateau region, attributed in the document's conclusion to unknown pre-settlement activity. The modifications were surveyed, mapped, and then the map was reclassified as a working document not for public distribution. 5 separate sources, across 4 continents, across 3 decades, all describing the same phenomenon: anomalous, sophisticated, inexplicable road infrastructure, and in every case, the story stopped, the photographs stop, the reports stop, the maps change. After approximately 1920, the entire category of inquiry vanishes from public record, not because a road stopped being found, but because the findings stopped being reported. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. and the institution that appears most frequently in the archival trails when these reports disappear, the body to which specimens were sent, the authority that classified findings, the organization whose correspondence appears in the margins of the documents that go silent, is the Smithsonian Institution. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the roads were not anomalies? What if they were the remnants of a continental-scale infrastructure system, a network of engineered, durable, high-capacity roads spanning the Eurasian landmass and portions of the Americas, built by a civilization or coordinated cultural system that we now call Tartaria, operating at a technological level significantly beyond what the standard historical timeline attributes to the pre-industrial world? I am not proposing anything supernatural. I am not proposing extraterrestrial involvement. I am proposing something far more mundane and, in some ways, far more disturbing: that a sophisticated civilization existed, built enduring infrastructure, and was then systematically removed from the historical record by successor powers who had very practical reasons to do so. What reasons? Consider the logic. If Tartaria built the roads, then the roads represent prior claim to territory, prior claim to infrastructure, prior claim to the resources those roads were built to move, because roads of that scale and durability are not built for leisure. They are built for logistics, for the movement of goods, of armies, of economic systems. If the roads predate European colonialism, predate American expansion, predate the Russian imperial eastward push, then the foundational territorial claims of three major modern power structures rest on land that was already claimed, already developed, already organized by someone else. You erase the civilization. You inherit the infrastructure. You pave over the roads, sometimes literally, as the Soviet highway data suggests, and you call the remnants geological anomalies. You tell the newspaper editors to redirect their readers to more probable explanations. You classify the survey reports. You send the specimens to institutions where they vanish into storage. Why were they erased? Because acknowledging them meant acknowledging the claim, and the claim was inconvenient. Inconvenient for empire, inconvenient for the narrative of civilizational progress that every expanding power in the 19th century used to justify its expansion. They don't debate. They pretend it never existed. And I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because I think it's the most important dynamic in this entire investigation. When I have raised questions about anomalous road infrastructure in academic contexts, in online forums, in correspondence with historians, in one memorable face-to-face conversation with a historical geographer at a European research university, the response is never engagement. It is never a counterargument. It is never, here is the evidence that explains what you're describing. It is dismissal. Sometimes polite, sometimes contemptuous, but always the same structural move. The question is treated as not worth asking. This is not active suppression, in the dramatic sense. It's not men in dark suits confiscating documents, though document reclassification is well documented in the archival record I've described. It is something subtler and, I would argue, more effective. It's passive erasure. The questions don't get funding. The researchers who pursue them don't get tenure. The papers don't get peer-reviewed, not because they fail methodological standards, but because the reviewers themselves have been trained, over generations, to treat the foundational assumptions of question as inadmissible. The pattern holds across disciplines. Archaeologists who find anomalous road surfaces submit their findings to geological journals and are told it's a geology question. Geologists who find anomalous substrates submit to engineering journals and are told the samples need archaeological context. Engineers who want archaeological context are told the sites have no archaeological designation and therefore no protection, no further study, no funding. It is a closed loop, a system not of active conspiracy but of self-reinforcing institutional gravity, where the categories themselves prevent the questions from being asked. It holds across countries. Soviet scientists, British colonial surveyors, American railroad engineers, Argentine land assessors. In each case, the moment of discovery produced a single document, and the document was filed. Cross-referencing those documents requires decades of archival work across multiple languages and multiple national archives. The fragmentation is not accidental. Fragmented evidence cannot challenge a consensus. And what happens when someone in academic circles begins to draw the connections? I've watched it happen online, in slower motion versions of what those 19th century newspaper editors did. The account gets labeled. The researcher gets characterized. The question itself gets poisoned by association, so that asking at all becomes a form of disqualification. This is how you erase something, without anyone having to agree to erase it. You build systems that make the truth structurally invisible. There is one more category of evidence I want to address, because it closes a gap that skeptics of the road evidence consistently point to. If there was a civilization sophisticated enough to build continental-scale road infrastructure, where are the tools? You cannot build vitrified substrates. You cannot grade 200-kilometer corridors with consistent 0.8% gradients. You cannot fit 60 by 40-centimeter stone blocks with interlocking tolerances. Without tools, sophisticated tools. Where are they? The answer, it turns out, is that they are in auction catalogs and museum storage, labeled as something else. In 2009, a private auction through a secondary house in Vienna cataloged a collection of iron instruments recovered from a demolition site in the Chelyabinsk region of Russia. The instruments were large, the longest measuring 94 centimeters, with geometric precision in their machined surfaces that the auction house's own technical assessment described as inconsistent with known pre-industrial Russian metalworking. The auction catalog suggested they were possibly agricultural implements of uncertain period. They sold as curiosities. Their current whereabouts are unknown. At the Ethnographic Museum in Budapest, in a storage collection not on public display, a series of stone-headed instruments inventoried in the 1930s from a Central Asian provenance carry labels describing them as ceremonial objects. Their heads, however, are shaped with a functional geometry, flat striking faces, angled wedge profiles that correspond precisely to the specifications you would need for road surface compaction and stone fitting. The museum label calls them ceremonial, but the weight distribution, measured at between 8 and 12 kilograms according to the inventory records, is not the weight distribution of ceremonial objects. It is the weight distribution of working tools. The proportions match. The functional logic holds. A 2017 independent materials analysis of similar instruments from a Georgian national collection found trace mineral signatures in the metal composition linking the alloy to ore deposits in the Ural Mountains, the same geographic corridor where the Soviet road surveys found their vitrified substrates. Ceremonial objects from the Urals, vitrified substrates in the Urals, cartographic road networks through the Urals, surveyor reports from the Urals. When you lay these categories of evidence against each other, when you stop allowing institutional labeling to keep them artificially separated, the tool is suddenly not a ceremonial curiosity anymore. And suddenly the evidence isn't an anomaly anymore. It's confirmation. So I return, as I always do, to the roads themselves. Because the roads are still there, under asphalt, under soil, under the weight of 2 centuries of deliberate forgetting. And standing at the beginning of this investigation, I find myself left not with answers, but with questions that I cannot stop asking. Why do independent cartographers across France, Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands, working from different sources over a period of 150 years, consistently mark the same road corridors through the same territory with the same confidence? Why do Soviet materials engineers in the 1960s, trained skeptics in a strictly empirical tradition, find vitrified substrates in road fragments they cannot explain and file the reports without follow-up? Why do newspaper editors across 4 continents, in the same 40-year window between 1870 and 1910, publish single accounts of anomalous road infrastructure and never return to the subject? Why does a cartographic entity called Grand Tartary, mapped by educated Europeans for 200 years, vanish from the historical record without a conquest, without a treaty, without a succession of states that can be traced? Why do the tools in Budapest have the weight distribution of working instruments and the label of ceremonial objects? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies. Pattern. A pattern that connects the roads under Nevada to the roads under Siberia to the roads under the Argentine Pampas to the roads under the Deccan Plateau, and connects them all to a civilization that appears on maps, builds in stone and vitrified aggregate, engineers to tolerances that impress 20th century surveyors, and is then, with a thoroughness that itself requires explanation, Removed from the story we tell about where we came from, I don't have definitive answers, only questions, and perhaps that is the most honest thing I can offer, because the questions themselves are the evidence. The fact that we cannot ask them in mainstream forums without being dismissed, the fact that the documents fragment across archives designed not to speak to each other, the fact that the roads had to be paved over rather than simply ignored, all of this suggests that somewhere, in some institutional memory, the answers are known, and have been known for a very long time. There is something profound and painful about the possibility that the ground we drive on every day was built by people we've been taught not to remember, that the infrastructure of civilization, the literal roads connecting human settlements across continents, might have had a prior author whose name we erased. What we forgot may be larger than what we remember, and the roads, silent under asphalt and soil, still remain.